Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. Today, my heart overflows with joy as we gather once again in this sacred space of storytelling and connection. Each time we come together, I feel the beautiful tapestry of our global family strengthening, every thread, every color, every pattern essential to its magnificence. Bowing my head in gratitude. Almighty Father, we come before you with hearts full of thanksgiving. Thank you for the miracle of bringing souls together from across vast oceans and distant mountains. Pour your divine protection over each precious family member watching today. Shelter them from life's storms, fill their bodies with vibrant health, and plant seeds of unshakable joy in their hearts. Illuminate our path as we journey through stories that heal, transform, and unite us. Sanctify this gathering. Amen. My treasured family, I'm burning with curiosity. Where in this magnificent world are you joining from today? Are you watching from America's sprawling landscapes where freedom dances with the American beauty rose? Or perhaps from Britain's historic shores, where the Tudor rose stands as a testament to resilience through centuries? Maybe you're with us from South Africa's breathtaking terrain, where the majestic King Protea reaches toward heaven like our own dreams. Or from Canada's vast wilderness, where the delicate white trillium whispers secrets of quiet strength. Could you be joining from Australia's sun-baked earth, where the golden wattle shines with the brilliance of 1,000 suns? Or from the paradise islands of the Caribbean, each blessed with nature's most stunning creations, Jamaica's lignum vitae, standing proud and unyielding, Trinidad and Tobago's fiery Chaconia, blazing with passion, Barbados' pride flower, unfurling its glory without apology, the Bahamas' yellow elder, radiating sunshine even in darkness, Dominica's mysterious Bois Quaib, holding ancient wisdom, St. Lucia's rose and marguerite, embodying perfect harmony, Grenada's cascading bougainvillea, fearless in its beauty. I yearn to hear your voice in the comments below. Whether you're surrounded by the pulsing energy of city lights or embraced by the soul-stirring silence of countryside dawns, speak. Let your presence be known. Our last two stories. Did they pierce the veil between my words and your soul? Did they awaken memories long dormant? Did tears stream down your face, or did laughter bubble up from the depths of your being? Your truth, raw and unfiltered, is the greatest gift you can offer. Attendance call. Thunder your presence in the comments with a resounding present. Let us feel the earth shake with the power of our united family. Remember this truth that burns within my soul. Each of you, yes, you reading these words right now, carries an irreplaceable light. Without your flame, our family constellation remains incomplete. With a heart overflowing with boundless love, Mr. Peter, pour your soul into the comments below. The grey morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains of the Nathan's modest apartment on the outskirts of Boston. Nairobi stood motionless before the cracked mirror, a living statue draped in white cotton. The simple wedding dress her mother had sewn by hand hung from her slender frame, the uneven hem brushing against her ankles. She traced the intricate embroidery along the neckline, her mother's attempt to infuse beauty into necessity. Nairobi's dark fingers trembled slightly as they moved to the small wooden pendant around her neck, carved by her grandmother in Kenya. It was her last tangible connection to her homeland that grew more distant with each passing year. 10 years in America had taught the Nathan family that dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. Outside, the persistent drizzle that had begun at dawn showed no signs of relenting. Perfect weather for a funeral, Nairobi thought bitterly, or a wedding without love. The floorboards creaked in the hallway, announcing her father's approach before he appeared in the doorway. Mwangi Nathan, once tall and proud, now stooped from years of manual labor that had paid for their cramped apartment and meager existence. His eyes, normally warm and expressive, now darted around the room, refusing to meet his daughter's gaze directly. "You look beautiful," he said, his accent thickening with emotion. He cleared his throat, straightening the second-hand suit jacket that hung loosely from his shoulders. Travis Head is a good man. He has a steady job, a house in a good neighborhood. You will never know hunger again. The words rang hollow in the small room. They both knew what this was, not a union of hearts, but a calculated transaction. Nairobi was 22, educated at community college, with dreams of becoming a teacher, but dreams didn't put food on the table or pay for her mother's mounting medical bills. "Yes, Baba," she replied, the Swahili term for father slipping out as it always did in moments of emotional turbulence. "Mr. Head is generous to take me." Her father flinched at her phrasing but didn't correct it. They both understood the reality. Travis Head, a 40-year-old mid-level executive at a local import company, had met Nairobi at a community function where she had been serving food. His interest had been immediate and pragmatic. A bachelor set in his ways, he wanted a wife who would keep his house, cook his meals, and provide companionship without the complications of an American woman with career ambitions. When he had approached Mwangi with his proposition, offering financial security for their family in exchange for Nairobi's hand, her father had seized the opportunity with the desperation of a drowning man clutching at driftwood. "Your mother is waiting in the car," Mwangi said, breaking the heavy silence. "We should not be late." As Nairobi gathered her small bouquet of supermarket carnations, she caught a final glimpse of herself in the mirror. The young woman staring back seemed like a stranger, eyes dulled by resignation, shoulders already carrying the weight of compromise. The ceremony at the county courthouse was brief and perfunctory. Travis arrived exactly on time, dressed in a navy suit that emphasized his thinning hair and the beginning of a paunch. He nodded curtly to Nairobi's parents before taking his place beside her. Throughout the judge's recitation, he maintained a polite but detached expression, as though he was signing a particularly important business contract. In a way, that's exactly what it was. Nairobi's mother, Amara, wept silently in the back row, her frail body shaking with each suppressed sob. The cancer treatments had left her gaunt, her once beautiful face now a canvas of pain, barely masked by her brave smile. When it came time to exchange rings, Travis slipped a plain gold band onto Nairobi's finger. Not too expensive, practical, like everything else about him. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge announced, his bored voice suggesting this was the 10th such ceremony that morning. No mention of love or cherishing, no flowery promises about forever. Just a legal declaration, binding and final. Travis did not kiss her. Instead, he offered a brief nod, as though they had just concluded a satisfactory business meeting. The courthouse steps were slick with rain as they exited. Travis opened an umbrella, careful to hold it over Nairobi to protect her dress, a small kindness that she noted with a flare of desperate hope. Perhaps there would be others. "We'll drop your parents at their apartment," Travis stated, not a question, but an announcement of his plans, the first of many decisions he would make without consulting her. The drive was silent apart from the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers battling the persistent rain. Boston's gray skyline seemed to mirror Nairobi's mood, the towering buildings indifferent to the small drama unfolding beneath them. In the rearview mirror, she watched her parents huddled together in the back seat, her father staring stoically ahead, her mother's eyes still glistening with tears. When they arrived at the Nathan's apartment complex, Travis remained in the car while Nairobi stepped out to say her goodbyes. The moment held a terrible finality. Though they lived just across town, everyone understood that things would never be the same. "Be strong, my Nairobi," her mother whispered in her ear as they embraced. In Swahili, she added, "Remember who you are, the daughter of warriors." Her father's goodbye was more restrained, a formal handshake followed by a sudden, crushing hug that spoke of regret and love in equal measure. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "I have failed you." "No, Baba," Nairobi insisted, feeling a sudden role reversal as she comforted him. "You have saved our family. I am proud to do this." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she delivered it convincingly. Years of holding their family together had made her adept at hiding her true feelings. Back in the car, Travis waited impatiently, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. As they pulled away, Nairobi twisted in her seat, watching her parents grow smaller in the distance until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the rain and fog. The drive to Travis's house in the suburbs took 40 minutes, each mile increasing the distance between Nairobi and everything familiar. The neighborhoods gradually transformed, buildings growing farther apart, lawns appearing and expanding, wrought iron fences giving way to neatly trimmed hedges. Travis's house sat on a quiet street lined with identical homes, each with its carefully maintained lawn and two-car garage. Nothing extravagant by American standards, but to Nairobi, who had grown up in a crowded apartment with shared bathrooms, it seemed impossibly spacious. "We're here," Travis announced unnecessarily as he pulled into the driveway. He switched off the engine and turned to look at Nairobi for what felt like the first time that day. His gaze was assessing, like someone inspecting a newly purchased appliance for defects. "There are a few things we should clarify," he continued, his tone businesslike. "I keep a structured household. Dinner at 6:30 sharp, laundry on Wednesdays and Saturdays. The guest bedroom will be yours until we adjust to our arrangement." Nairobi nodded, clutching her small suitcase containing everything she owned. The knowledge that she would have her own room came as an unexpected relief. "I've cleared half the closet in the master bathroom for your things," Travis continued, "though I don't imagine you have much to put in there." The casual cruelty of the remark stung, but Nairobi kept her expression neutral. This was her life now. Her role was clear, grateful recipient of Travis Head's generosity. As they walked to the front door, Nairobi noticed the neighbors watching from behind curtains and over garden fences. A young black woman in a wedding dress, entering the home of the neighborhood's confirmed bachelor, would certainly give them something to discuss at their next block party. The house's interior was exactly as Nairobi had imagined it, meticulously organized, sparsely furnished, devoid of warmth or personality. Beige walls met beige carpeting. The furniture was functional rather than comfortable. No family photos, no artwork, not even a stray magazine to suggest that someone actually lived there rather than merely existed within these walls. "You can put your things away and then start dinner," Travis said, loosening his tie as he headed toward what Nairobi assumed was his study. "I prefer my steak medium rare. There should be everything you need in the kitchen." Left alone in the entryway, Nairobi stood motionless, the full weight of her new reality settling over her like a shroud. This morning she had been Nairobi Nathan, daughter of Mwangi and Amara, community college student with dreams of teaching kindergarten. Now she was Mrs. Travis Head, a stranger's wife, a household appliance with a heartbeat. She walked slowly up the carpeted stairs, her wedding dress brushing against the walls of the narrow staircase. The guest bedroom was small but functional, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the backyard. Nairobi placed her suitcase on the bed and began the process of unpacking her meager belongings. A few dresses, 2 pairs of jeans, some blouses her mother had altered to fit her slender frame. At the bottom of the suitcase lay a small wooden carving of a lioness, another gift from her grandmother. Nairobi placed it carefully on the windowsill, a small act of personalization in this sterile environment. The lioness seemed to stare back at her with knowing eyes. "Protect your heart," it seemed to say. "The journey ahead will require all your strength." After changing into a simple dress, Nairobi made her way to the kitchen to prepare Travis's dinner. The kitchen, at least, was well equipped, with appliances Nairobi had only seen in magazine advertisements. She found the steaks in the refrigerator, already marinating in a sealed container with a label indicating the date of preparation. Even his food was organized with military precision. As she worked, Nairobi tried to focus on the positives. The house was clean and comfortable. She would have her own room, at least for now. Her parents would receive financial support. Her mother would continue her treatments. These were not small things. By the time Travis returned to the kitchen, Nairobi had set the table and prepared a meal that would have impressed even her mother, whose cooking skills were legendary in their community. Travis inspected the food with a critical eye before nodding his approval. They ate in silence, the only sound the quiet clink of cutlery against plates. Nairobi waited for some acknowledgement of her efforts, some small word of thanks, but none came. When he finished, Travis simply placed his napkin beside his plate and stood. "I have work to finish in my study," he announced. "You can clear up here." As he turned to leave, he paused in the doorway, his back to Nairobi. For a moment, she thought he might say something kind, something to suggest that this arranged marriage might eventually grow into something more than a business transaction. Instead, his shoulders stiffened, and without turning around, he said, "Don't expect too much. This is a practical arrangement. Nothing more." The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. Nairobi felt a chill run through her body, settling into her bones. This wasn't just a marriage without love. It was a contract signed in invisible ink, the fine print revealing itself only after it was too late to back out. As Travis's footsteps receded down the hallway, Nairobi remained at the table, staring at the half-eaten meal she had prepared with such care. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained overcast, threatening to release another downpour at any moment. Mechanically, she began to clear the table, washing each dish with methodical precision. With each plate she dried and put away, the reality of her situation became clearer. She had traded her freedom for security, her dreams for stability, her future for her family's present. In the sterile kitchen of a stranger's house, Nairobi Nathan, now Nairobi Head, faced the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She had not just married Travis Head. She had signed away her life. And as the evening shadows lengthened across the immaculate kitchen, Nairobi wondered if the price of security might be higher than anyone had calculated. Chapter 2. Cold Reality. 6 months had transformed Nairobi's existence into something unrecognizable from the life she had once known. The days bled into one another in Travis Head's immaculate suburban house, each sunrise bringing the same precise routine, each sunset closing another day of quiet desperation. The transition from guest bedroom to master suite had happened 3 weeks after their wedding. Travis had appeared at her door one evening, his expression unreadable in the hallway's dim light. "It's time," he had said simply. "People will talk if they know we're sleeping separately." That night had been mechanical, devoid of tenderness or passion. Travis had approached their marital duties with the same efficiency he applied to everything else in his life, a task to be completed rather than an intimacy to be shared. Nairobi had closed her eyes and thought of her mother's medical bills being paid, of her father's relief at no longer working double shifts, of the small monthly allowance that arrived at her parents' apartment with reliable precision. Now, half a year into this arrangement they called marriage, Nairobi had mastered the art of anticipating Travis's needs before he voiced them. Breakfast ready at precisely 6:45 a.m., steel-cut oatmeal with measured portions of blueberries and exactly 3/4 of a cup of black coffee, shirts laundered with medium starch, trousers pressed with perfect creases, dinner time to be placed on the table within 5 minutes of his arrival home. The house gleamed with her efforts, baseboards dustless, windows streakless, floors polished to a soft shine. Yet no matter how immaculate she kept their home, it never felt like hers. She remained a guest, tolerated for her usefulness, her presence acknowledged only when something required her attention. What she hadn't expected, despite the cold pragmatism of their arrangement, was the constant degradation. That evening in early autumn, Nairobi stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. Herb-crusted salmon, Travis's preference for Wednesdays. The knife moved rhythmically through fresh dill, her hands steady and practiced after months of cooking elaborate meals that went unappreciated. She had learned that food was the one area where Travis expected excellence rather than mere competence. His standards had driven her to become an exceptional cook, though he rarely acknowledged her skill. The front door opened and closed with a decisive click. Travis's footsteps followed the hallway to the kitchen, where he paused in the doorway, loosening his tie with one hand, tumbler of whiskey already in the other. Nairobi had learned to have his drink ready by the door, the crystal glass filled with precisely 2 fingers of Glenfiddich and 3 ice cubes. "The Harrison account fell through," he announced without preamble, his tone clipped with barely contained frustration. Nairobi knew better than to respond. These announcements required acknowledgement, not conversation. She nodded slightly, keeping her eyes on the herbs she was chopping. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she offered quietly. Travis moved to the kitchen island, positioning himself where he could watch her work. This was part of the routine too, his silent observation, his critical gaze assessing her every movement. The weight of his stare made her shoulders tense, though she had grown adept at hiding her discomfort. "Look at you," Travis sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Your skin so dark against the white countertops, like a shadow moving through my house." The knife paused fractionally before continuing its steady rhythm. Nairobi kept her eyes down, focusing on the precise angle of the blade through the delicate herbs. She had learned that responding only made things worse. "I did you a favor, you know," he continued, sipping his whiskey. "No one else would have married you. Your father practically begged me." Each word cut deeper than any physical blow could have. When she had first arrived in America at 12 years old, Nairobi had been teased mercilessly for her accent, her traditional clothing, her packed lunches of unfamiliar foods, but she had never been made to feel ashamed of her appearance. Her mother had instilled in her a fierce pride in her heritage, calling her Midnight's daughter, telling her bedtime stories of Kenyan queens whose ebony skin had been celebrated in songs and poems. Now, Travis had turned even that into something to be ashamed of. "Jenkins asked me today why I chose you," Travis continued, moving to refill his glass. "Can you imagine? As if I owed him an explanation for my personal decisions." Nairobi slid the chopped herbs into a small bowl, her movements deliberate and controlled. She had become an expert at maintaining her exterior composure while her mind retreated to safer places. In these moments, she often imagined herself back in Kenya, running through her grandmother's village with cousins she barely remembered, the sun warm on her skin, laughter following their footsteps like music. "I told him it was practical," Travis was saying, his voice cutting through her momentary escape. "An American wife would have expectations, demands, career ambitions." He pronounced the last words with particular disdain. "But you understand your place." The salmon sizzled as Nairobi placed it in the hot pan, the sound temporarily drowning out Travis's voice. She focused on the familiar task, adjusting the heat with practiced precision. Cooking had become her refuge, the one activity where she could lose herself in the process, where her skills were at least useful, if not appreciated. "My mother called again," Travis said, abruptly changing the subject. "She wants us to visit next month for Thanksgiving." This was new information, requiring a response. Nairobi turned slightly, careful to keep her expression neutral. Would you like me to make travel arrangements? Travis studied her for a moment, his gaze calculating. No, he decided. I've told her we have other commitments. She's become too interested in our marriage, asking questions about when we're planning to start a family. The thought sent a cold wave through Nairobi's body. A child, another life, bound to this empty existence. She had once dreamed of motherhood, of passing down her mother's stories and her grandmother's wisdom to children of her own. But to bring a child into this cold, sterile relationship felt like a cruelty she couldn't bear to contemplate. I've made it clear that children aren't in our future, Travis continued, watching her reaction closely. That wasn't part of our arrangement. Relief washed over her, though she was careful not to let it show. Whatever you think is best, she murmured, returning her attention to the meal preparation. Your obedience is your most attractive quality, Travis observed, a hint of mockery in his tone. Though I sometimes wonder what goes on behind those eyes of yours. More than you can imagine, Nairobi thought, but kept the words locked safely inside. In the privacy of her mind, she maintained the one space Travis couldn't control. There she still taught imaginary classes of kindergarteners, still walked the streets of Nairobi, her namesake city she barely remembered, still dreamed of a life where she was valued for more than her utility. Dinner proceeded with the usual formality. Travis ate methodically, occasionally commenting on the food or sharing some anecdote from his workday that required no response beyond an attentive nod. Nairobi had perfected the art of being present, yet invisible, engaged, yet silent. It was a delicate balance that left her mentally exhausted. After dinner, Travis retreated to his study as he did most evenings. This was Nairobi's time, 2 precious hours to herself before he expected her in their bedroom. Early in their marriage, she had attempted to use this time to read, to study, to maintain some connection to her former ambitions. But Travis had noticed the community college textbooks she had brought with her. "What exactly do you think you're going to do with an education?" he had asked, his tone genuinely puzzled. "Your role is here, in this house. I didn't marry you to support some pointless academic exercise." The books had disappeared from their home the next day. Nairobi never asked what had happened to them. Now she used her evening hours to call her parents, to write in the journal she kept hidden beneath the guest bathroom's loose floorboard, or simply to sit in the small garden behind the house and remember what it felt like to have hopes beyond survival. Tonight, she dialed her parents' number, the familiar sequence of tones bringing a small measure of comfort. Her father answered on the 3rd ring, his voice instantly warming as he recognized her. "Nairobi, how are you, my daughter?" Their conversations were always careful, both sides maintaining the fiction that her marriage was a success, that the sacrifice had been worthwhile. Neither acknowledged the weight in her voice or the pauses where honesty might have lived. "I'm well, Baba," she replied, the familiar term of endearment slipping out naturally. "How is Mama feeling?" "Better today," he said, the relief in his voice genuine. "The new medication seems to be helping. The doctor is very pleased with her progress." This, at least, was the truth that made everything bearable. Her mother was receiving treatment that would have been impossible without Travis's financial support. The monthly statements from the hospital arrived with Travis's name prominently displayed as the guarantor. Whatever else he might be, he had kept that promise. "Can I speak with her?" Nairobi asked, settling into the window seat in the guest bedroom, her one small rebellion, using this space that was supposed to be solely for visitors as her personal retreat. Her mother's voice, though weaker than it had once been, still carried the warmth and strength that had guided Nairobi through childhood. "My midnight daughter," Amara Nathan greeted her. "You sound tired tonight." Nairobi closed her eyes against sudden tears. Her mother had always been able to hear what she didn't say. Just busy, she deflected. Travis's house is large, and he likes everything just so. Travis's house, her mother repeated softly. Not your home. The observation struck too close to the truth. How are you feeling? Nairobi asked instead of answering. They spoke for 20 minutes, carefully navigating around the subjects that might reveal too much. Nairobi shared news of the garden she was planting. Her mother spoke of neighbors and community gossip. Neither mentioned the future. Neither spoke of dreams. When Nairobi hung up, the silence of the house seemed to press against her skin. She sat motionless, watching the evening shadows lengthen across the perfectly manicured lawn. Time was running out. Soon, she would need to prepare herself for bed, for Travis's presence beside her. At night, Travis slept as far from her as the bed would allow, turning his back to her immediately after their infrequent and perfunctory physical encounters. Though Nairobi had never known romantic love, she felt its absence like a physical ache. She would lie awake in the darkness, listening to his measured breathing, wondering if this emptiness was all her life would ever hold. In those quiet hours, Nairobi often found herself remembering a story her grandmother had told her as a child. It was about a young woman who had been swallowed by a river spirit during a drought. The woman lived beneath the water for 7 years, learning the secrets of the river before returning to her village with the knowledge to end the drought and save her people. Sometimes, her grandmother had said, we must surrender to the darkness before we can bring back the light. As Nairobi rose to prepare for another night beside a man who viewed her as a possession rather than a partner, she wondered if she was still in those underwater years, learning painful lessons that would someday make sense, or if, unlike the woman in the story, she would remain submerged forever, forgotten by the world above. The moonlight filtered through the curtains as she slipped quietly into the master bathroom. The face that looked back at her from the mirror was still recognizably her own, but something had changed in her eyes. The light that had once prompted her teachers to comment on her spark had dimmed to a careful wariness. Endure, she whispered to her reflection, the word half prayer, half command. Just endure. Chapter 3. The diagnosis. The morning Travis collapsed in the bathroom, Nairobi's first instinct was fear, not for him, but of being blamed. She stood frozen in the doorway, watching his body convulse against the pristine white tiles, water from the shower still running behind him. The scene seemed surreal in the immaculate bathroom, like a violent brushstroke across a perfect canvas. Her training in first aid from community college resurfaced through her panic. Nairobi knelt beside Travis, carefully turning him onto his side. His face had taken on an alarming greyish pallor, his breathing shallow and irregular. She reached for her phone with shaking hands, mentally rehearsing explanations to the emergency operators. Would they believe this was simply a medical emergency, or would they hear her accent and immediately assume something sinister? 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. My husband, Nairobi managed to say, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. He collapsed in the bathroom. He's breathing but unconscious. The dispatch asked for their address, which Nairobi provided with mechanical precision. As she followed the dispatcher's instructions to check Travis's pulse and breathing, she found herself mentally calculating the little money she had saved from the household allowance Travis grudgingly provided. If he died, what would happen to her? To her parents? To her mother's medical care? The guilt that followed this thought was immediate and crushing. Whatever their relationship, she shouldn't be thinking of practicalities while he lay suffering on the floor. The ambulance is approximately 4 minutes away, the dispatcher informed her. Can you unlock your front door? Nairobi placed the phone on speaker and ran to open the door, returning quickly to Travis's side. His eyelids fluttered, a low moan escaping his lips. For a brief moment, he seemed to recognize her, confusion and vulnerability replacing his usual cold assessment. What? He began, before another spasm of pain contorted his features. "Don't try to talk," Nairobi instructed, surprising herself with her authoritative tone. "An ambulance is coming." The arrival of the paramedics brought a flurry of activity to the normally quiet house. They moved with practiced efficiency, their questions direct and rapid. Nairobi answered as best she could, suddenly aware of how little she knew about Travis's medical history. Did he have allergies, previous heart problems, family history of illness? She could only shake her head, the gaps in their relationship exposed with each unanswered question. "I'll follow in our car," she told the lead paramedic as they loaded Travis onto a stretcher. The woman gave her a quick, assessing glance, perhaps noting the lack of hysteria one might expect from a devoted wife. "Massachusetts General," she said simply. "They'll take him to the emergency department." Nairobi changed quickly from her robe into a simple dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. In the bathroom, she stepped carefully around the puddle of water still on the floor. Travis's monogrammed towel lay in a heap, so unlike his usual fastidiousness. The normalcy of the house, the coffee maker timed to start brewing in 20 minutes, the newspaper waiting on the front step, seemed absurdly at odds with the chaos that had just unfolded. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Nairobi navigated the morning traffic on autopilot, her mind racing with possibilities. If Travis was seriously ill, what would it mean for their arrangement? Would his family intervene? Travis rarely spoke of them, except for the occasional mention of his mother's disapproval of their marriage. At the hospital, Nairobi was directed to a waiting area after providing insurance information. The stark fluorescent lighting emphasized the paleness of her complexion after the morning's shock. She sat rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic chair, surrounded by others in various states of distress. A mother comforting a feverish child, an elderly man dozing with an oxygen tank beside him, a young couple clutching each other's hands as they waited for news. Hours passed. Nairobi made the necessary calls to Travis's office, explaining his absence, to her parents, keeping her tone light to avoid worrying them. A kind nurse brought her a cup of coffee, which grew cold in her hands as she stared at the swinging doors, waiting for information. It was nearly noon when a doctor finally emerged, his face a professional mask that revealed nothing. "Mrs. Head?" he called, consulting his clipboard. Nairobi rose, suddenly aware of the curious glances from others in the waiting room. Even here, the contrast between her name and her appearance drew attention. "I'm Dr. Khatri," the doctor said, leading her to a quieter corner. "Your husband is stable now. We've run several tests and scans." "What happened to him?" Nairobi asked, her voice smaller than she intended. The doctor's face was grave when he finally spoke. "Mr. Head has a rare condition affecting his heart. The technical term is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with an unusual electrical conduction complication. Without specialized treatment, his prognosis is poor." Nairobi absorbed this information, trying to understand its implications. Poor meaning. 6 months to a year without intervention, Dr. Khatri clarified, his tone gentle but direct. The condition causes the heart muscle to thicken abnormally. In your husband's case, it's affecting the electrical system of his heart as well, causing dangerous arrhythmias. "What kind of treatment?" Nairobi asked, surprising herself by speaking with such composure when internally she felt as though the floor was tilting beneath her. "There's an experimental procedure being developed at the Brigham. It's a combination of surgical intervention and a new drug therapy." The doctor hesitated before continuing. "It's expensive, around $200,000, and because it's classified as experimental, insurance won't cover it." The amount hit Nairobi like a physical blow. More money than she could imagine, certainly more than they had access to, even with Travis's comfortable salary and savings. "Is there any alternative?" she asked, already knowing the answer from the doctor's expression. Conventional treatments will help manage symptoms, perhaps extend his timeline somewhat, but they won't address the underlying issue. Dr. Khartri's pager beeped, and he glanced at it apologetically. "You can see your husband now. He's been moved to room 412. We'll keep him for observation at least through tomorrow." Nairobi thanked him automatically, her mind still reeling from the financial implications. $200,000. The figure seemed impossible, astronomical. Even if they sold the house, liquidated Travis's investments, which she knew existed but had no access to, it might not be enough. The elevator ride to the 4th floor gave her time to compose herself. Whatever their relationship, Travis was facing a death sentence without this procedure. The ethical calculus wasn't complicated. She needed to help him access this treatment, if possible. Room 412 was dim and quiet except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. Travis looked smaller somehow, fragile in the hospital bed. The usual hard lines of his face had softened in unconsciousness, making him appear closer to his actual age rather than the older persona he cultivated. An IV line snaked from his arm, and electrodes monitored his heart rhythm on a screen beside the bed. Nairobi approached cautiously, unsure of the protocol. In 20 months of marriage, Travis had never been ill, never shown any vulnerability. This new version of him, dependent, fragile, was unfamiliar territory. She settled into the visitor's chair beside the bed, unsure whether to take his hand or maintain the distance that characterized their relationship. Before she could decide, Travis's eyes fluttered open, focusing gradually on her face. For a moment, confusion clouded his features. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by the guard that always came down when he looked at her. Even in crisis, his defenses remained intact. "What happened?" His voice was raspy, barely audible. Nairobi explained what the doctors had told her, carefully watching his face for reaction. Travis listened silently, his expression hardening as she outlined the experimental treatment and its cost. "Insurance won't cover it," he said flatly. Not a question, but a statement of the inevitable injustice of the system. "No," Nairobi confirmed, "but there must be options. Payment plans, perhaps, or clinical trials you could qualify for." Travis's laugh was bitter, ending in a wince of pain. "Clinical trials have waiting lists years long, and no hospital offers payment plans for experimental procedures." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why do you care? This could solve your problems quite neatly, couldn't it?" Despite everything, Nairobi felt a pang of pity. "You're my husband," she said simply. "I'm your jailer," Travis countered, his voice strengthening with anger. "Don't pretend this is a real marriage." The familiar cruelty should have hurt, but Nairobi found herself looking at it clinically now, recognizing it as the defense mechanism it was. Travis was afraid, and fear made him lash out. "This is your fault," he whispered, his voice weak but venom intact. "The stress of being married to you is killing me." Even facing death, Travis' head couldn't find kindness. Nairobi absorbed the accusation without flinching, years of practice allowing her to let the words wash over her without penetrating. "I'll speak with the financial counselor," she said pragmatically. "There may be options we haven't considered." Travis turned his face away, a dismissal she recognized well. Nairobi stood, gathering her purse. "I'll come back tomorrow morning," she said to his averted profile. "Is there anything you need from home?" The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Finally, Travis spoke without turning. "My laptop and the blue folder in my study, second drawer." Nairobi nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Rest," she said, a word that felt inadequate against the magnitude of his condition. In the hallway outside his room, Nairobi leaned against the wall, suddenly overwhelmed by the morning's events. $200,000, an impossible sum for a life she had no particular attachment to, yet felt responsible for preserving. What price would she ultimately pay for the security she had sought in this marriage? The irony wasn't lost on her. Travis Head, who had always positioned himself as her savior, now depended on her for his very survival. The power dynamic had shifted, but the outcome remained uncertain. If she couldn't find a way to finance his treatment, they would both lose: Travis, his life, and Nairobi, the precarious stability she had sacrificed so much to secure. As she made her way to the financial counselor's office, Nairobi felt an unfamiliar sensation taking root alongside her anxiety. Resolve. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the strength that had sustained her through years of quiet endurance. If there was a way forward through this crisis, she would find it. The alternative wasn't an option she was willing to contemplate, not because of love for Travis, but because of who she had determined to be despite everything. She would not let circumstances turn her into someone who abandoned others in their moment of greatest need, even those who had shown her little kindness. This was not about Travis anymore. It was about the woman Nairobi had promised herself she would remain, regardless of how the world treated her. Chapter 4. The sacrifice. For 6 months, Nairobi worked herself to exhaustion. After Travis's diagnosis, they had fallen into an uneasy alliance, not warmer, but more purposeful. He had been forced to take medical leave from his position, relying on disability payments that barely covered their mortgage. The expensive treatments that merely managed his symptoms, rather than addressing the root cause, drained their savings with alarming speed. Nairobi had taken a second job cleaning offices at night. Her education credentials from Kenya, finally useful in securing a part-time teaching assistant position at a local preschool during the day. She left the house at 6 each morning, returning only to prepare Travis's lunch before rushing to her evening job. By the time she collapsed into bed at midnight, her body ached with fatigue, but her mind continued to race with calculations and possibilities. They had managed to raise nearly $50,000, Travis reluctantly liquidating his prize stock portfolio, Nairobi selling the few pieces of jewelry her mother had given her, both of them cutting expenses to the bone. She had even called her struggling family for help, swallowing her pride as her father emptied his modest retirement account to contribute. Still, it wasn't enough. Travis's condition worsened daily, his once strong frame now gaunt, his breathing labored with the slightest exertion. The experimental treatment remained their only hope, its price tag mocking their desperate efforts to reach it. $200,000 might as well have been $2 million for all their ability to secure it. One evening, as she sat by his hospital bed during one of his increasingly frequent admissions, Travis looked at her with sudden clarity, the haze of pain medications temporarily lifting. "Do you want to save me?" he asked abruptly. The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked Nairobi what she wanted since the day her father had announced her engagement. "Yes," she said automatically, the duty of a wife ingrained too deeply to deny, despite everything that had passed between them. Travis studied her face, as if searching for the lie. Finding none, he glanced toward the door to ensure their privacy before speaking again, his voice low and measured. "Josh Inglis," Travis said, his eyes calculating even through his weakness. "The tech billionaire. I handled some minor contracts for one of his companies years ago. He noticed you at the company party last year." Nairobi frowned, trying to recall the event. It had been one of the few social occasions Travis had required her to attend, a holiday party where she had stood silently beside him, feeling out of place among the wealthy executives in her simple dress, conscious of the curious glances sent her way. "I don't remember meeting him," she said cautiously. "You didn't," Travis confirmed, but he noticed you, asked about you afterward. A bitter smile twisted his lips. I saw the way he looked at you, like you were some exotic treasure. Nairobi felt a chill of foreboding. Why are you telling me this now? Travis's expression hardened. Because he's worth billions. The cost of my treatment would be pocket change to him. He paused, the machines beeping steadily in the background. Spend one night with him. He'd pay enough to cover the treatment. The words hit Nairobi like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't process what Travis was suggesting. When understanding finally dawned, horror flooded through her. No, she whispered, rising from her chair. I cannot do that. You cannot ask that of me. Then you're killing me, Travis replied coldly, his voice gaining strength through anger. Some wife you are. Nairobi stood trembling beside the bed, memories rushing back. Her grandmother's teachings about dignity being a woman's most precious possession, her mother's quiet pride in raising a daughter with principles, her own determination to maintain her self-respect even in the coldest moments of her marriage. I have worked 2 jobs, she said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady. I have sold everything I own. My father emptied his savings for your treatment. I have done everything humanly possible. Except the one thing that would actually save me, Travis cut in. You would ask me to sell myself? The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. I'm asking you to make a practical decision, Travis countered. One night of discomfort in exchange for my life. Isn't that what marriage is? Sacrifice? Nairobi gathered her purse, desperate to escape before she said something unforgivable. I will come back tomorrow when you're thinking more clearly. He's in town this week, Travis called after her as she reached the door. The Boston Innovation Conference. It would be now or never. She closed the door firmly behind her, the hospital corridor suddenly spinning around her. Nauseated, Nairobi made her way to the nearest bathroom, barely reaching a stall before emptying the meager contents of her stomach. As she knelt on the cold tile floor, tears finally came, not delicate drops but harsh, racking sobs that left her gasping for breath. For days, Nairobi wrestled with the impossible choice: to degrade herself completely, or to let a man die. Even a man who had shown her nothing but cruelty. She thought of her parents, of the community that had supported their family, of the teachings she had grown up with. What would they think if they knew what she was considering? How could she face herself in the mirror afterward? Yet when she visited Travis and saw the grey pallor of his skin, the effort each breath cost him, another voice whispered that this was a human life hanging in the balance. Could she live with herself if she refused this chance, however repellent, to save him? In the end, duty won over dignity. With trembling hands, she found Josh Inglis's contact information in Travis's phone, saved there from their business dealings years earlier. Would this powerful man even remember noticing her? Was Travis's desperation clouding his judgment, creating a possibility that didn't exist? There was only one way to find out. The text message she composed was careful, ambiguous enough to avoid explicit proposition, clear enough to convey interest in meeting. Send, done. The digital equivalent of stepping off a cliff. The response came within hours. Polite, professional, suggesting a meeting at his hotel suite to discuss mutual business interests. No hint that he understood the true nature of her outreach, yet the privacy of the suggested location spoke volumes. As Nairobi prepared for the meeting, selecting the most elegant of her simple dresses, she tried to disconnect from what she was about to do. This wasn't her, not the girl raised with pride and principles in a Kenyan village, not the young woman who had dreamed of teaching children, not even the dutiful wife who had endured years of emotional cruelty. This was someone else, someone born of desperation and impossible choices. The luxury hotel in downtown Boston seemed to belong to another world entirely. Crystal chandeliers hung from soaring ceilings, plush carpets muffled her footsteps, staff in impeccable uniforms nodded respectfully as she passed. Nairobi felt like an imposter, her discount store dress and simple handbag marking her as an outsider despite her careful grooming. The elevator ride to the penthouse suite gave her one last chance to reconsider. Her finger hovered over the lobby button, temptation to flee nearly overwhelming. Then the image of Travis in his hospital bed flashed before her, dependent, diminished, dying. Whatever their relationship, whatever cruelties had passed between them, could she refuse this chance to save a human life? The elevator doors opened directly into the suite's private foyer. Nairobi stepped out, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, hands cold with dread. This was it, the moment she would sacrifice the last of her dignity on the altar of duty. Chapter 5. The Proposition. Josh Inglis's office occupied the top floor of a gleaming tower that seemed to touch the clouds. Rather than the hotel suite she had expected, his assistant had redirected Nairobi to the downtown headquarters of his tech empire. The change of venue had momentarily disoriented her, forcing a recalculation of what might be expected. The elevator whisked her upward in silent luxury, its mirrored walls reflecting a woman she barely recognized. Nairobi had worn her best dress, a simple navy sheath that had been on clearance at a department store, paired with the only piece of jewelry she hadn't sold, a thin silver necklace her mother had given her for her college graduation. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, makeup applied with careful restraint. Still, she felt out of place, clutching her worn purse as the numbers climbed toward the executive floor. The doors opened to reveal a reception area designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Boston Harbor, while minimalist furniture in creamy leather created an atmosphere of understated wealth. A sleek reception desk was staffed by a woman whose perfectly tailored suit probably cost more than Nairobi's entire wardrobe. "Mrs. Head," the receptionist greeted her with practiced warmth. "Mr. Inglis is expecting you. Right this way." Nairobi followed silently, hyper-aware of the soft click of the receptionist's heels against marble, the subtle scent of an expensive fragrance, the curious glances from staff they passed. What did they make of her? Did they know why she was here? The thought sent heat rushing to her face. The assistant stopped before a set of double doors, knocked once, then opened them with a practiced gesture. "Mrs. Head to see you, Mr. Inglis." The office beyond was vast, 3 walls of glass, offering views that made Boston look like a miniature model city. The 4th wall housed shelves of books and technology awards. The space was dominated by a massive desk of what appeared to be a single slab of polished wood, behind which stood the man himself. Josh Inglis was younger than she expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with the lean physique of someone who made time for fitness despite a demanding schedule. His dark hair was cut in an expensive style that managed to look both precise and casually tousled. He wore no tie with his crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone to reveal a glimpse of tanned skin. The relaxed attire did nothing to diminish the aura of power that surrounded him. "Mrs. Head," he greeted, coming around the desk to shake her hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, his smile revealing perfect teeth. "Please have a seat. Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee, water?" "Water, please," Nairobi managed, her throat suddenly dry. She perched on the edge of an armchair that probably cost more than Travis's monthly salary, watching as Inglis poured water from a crystal decanter. "I must admit, I was surprised to hear from you," he said, handing her the glass before leaning against his desk rather than returning to his seat, a casual posture that somehow increased rather than diminished his authoritative presence. "You mentioned a personal matter of some urgency." Nairobi took a sip of water, buying time as she searched for words. The speech she had rehearsed suddenly seemed absurd in this setting. How did one proposition a billionaire? What words could possibly bridge the gap between their worlds? "My husband is ill," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "A rare heart condition. There's an experimental treatment, but it's expensive. $200,000. Inglis's expression remained neutral, professionally sympathetic. "I'm sorry to hear that. That's a significant sum for most people." "For us, it's impossible," Nairobi admitted. "We've sold everything, borrowed from family. I've taken a second job. It's not enough." "And your insurance won't cover it because it's experimental," Inglis concluded, familiar with the cruel calculus of American healthcare. Nairobi nodded, then forced herself to continue. "My husband mentioned that you noticed me at a company event last year." Something flickered in Inglis's eyes, surprise quickly masked. "I remember," he said carefully. "He suggested—" Nairobi faltered, shame burning in her chest. She lowered her eyes, focusing on the immaculate carpet as she stumbled through her humiliating proposition. "He thought perhaps you might be willing to help with the cost of his treatment, in exchange for spending time with me." The silence that followed stretched painfully. When Inglis finally spoke, his voice was measured, revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Mrs. Head," he interrupted gently, "please stop." Tears of shame burned in Nairobi's eyes as Josh Inglis stood and walked to the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the city below. She wished the luxurious chair would swallow her whole, erase this moment, this desperate gamble that had led her to debase herself before a stranger. "I know your husband," he said finally, still facing the window. "We worked together briefly on a software licensing agreement for one of my smaller companies. I know what kind of man he is." He turned, his expression unreadable. "I've seen how he treats you." Nairobi's head snapped up in surprise. "What?" "At that corporate function," Inglis clarified. "I noticed you, yes, but not for the reasons your husband implies. I noticed how he spoke to you, how he dismissed you, how you flinched when he gripped your arm too tightly." His jaw tightened momentarily. "I considered reporting him to HR, but it wasn't my company's event. I had no standing." Nairobi sat frozen, mortified that a stranger had witnessed those private humiliations, yet also strangely relieved that someone had seen the truth of her situation. "Travis Head is not a good man," Inglis continued, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "And he's placed you in an impossible position." He returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed a checkbook. "I will give you the money for his treatment." The statement, delivered so casually, seemed impossible to process. Nairobi stared at him, waiting for the condition, the expectation that must follow such an offer. "But I will never touch you," Inglis continued, his gaze direct and unwavering. "That's not a transaction I would ever engage in." Disbelief warred with desperate hope in Nairobi's chest. "Why would you help us?" Josh's eyes softened. "Not him. You." He reached for his pen. "And this isn't charity. It's justice." "I don't understand," Nairobi said, watching as he wrote a check for an amount that would transform their situation completely. "Sometimes the universe places us in positions to right wrongs we witness," Inglis replied, his tone philosophical. "I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. You have a burden no one should have to carry." He tore the check from the book and held it out. "This seems like a simple equation to me." Nairobi hesitated before reaching for the check, half expecting him to pull it back, to reveal some hidden condition. But he released it easily, watching as she carefully folded it and placed it in her purse. "There's a condition," he said then, and Nairobi's heart sank. Of course there was. Nothing came without a price. "I'd like you to tell me your story sometime. Not today, not while this crisis is hanging over you. but someday. I think it might be important." The request was so unexpected, so far from what she had feared, that Nairobi found herself momentarily speechless. "My story isn't interesting," she finally managed. "I disagree," Inglis replied simply. "All stories matter, especially those that haven't been heard." He walked her to the door, his manner shifting smoothly to businesslike efficiency. "My private number is on the back of the check. When your husband's treatment is arranged, let me know how it proceeds. Medical science interests me." The plausible excuse for future contact was delivered smoothly, offering her dignity rather than placing her in his debt. As the elevator doors closed between them, Nairobi caught a final glimpse of Josh Inglis, powerful, wealthy, yet somehow more human than she had expected. As Nairobi left with the check, she felt something strange and unfamiliar, the first flicker of hope in years. Not just for Travis's recovery, but for a world where unexpected kindness could exist alongside casual cruelty, where her story might actually matter to someone. The weight of the check in her purse should have felt like salvation, but instead, it introduced a new kind of uncertainty. Travis had sent her to sell herself, expecting her degradation. How would he react to charity instead? What new dynamic would this create between them? For the first time in years, Nairobi found herself making a decision based not on Travis's expectations or needs, but on her own instincts. She would tell him the truth, that Josh Inglis had agreed to fund the treatment. But the personal details, the real nature of their conversation, the unexpected kindness she had encountered, those she would keep to herself, a small treasure of dignity reclaimed in the midst of desperation. As the city rushed past the taxi windows, Nairobi found herself contemplating Josh Inglis's parting words. All stories matter. Had hers ever mattered to anyone before? Had she ever believed it mattered? Perhaps, she thought as the hospital came into view, it was time to reconsider the narrative she had accepted for so long, that her role was to endure, to serve, to sacrifice. Perhaps there was another story waiting to be written, one where she wasn't merely a shadow in someone else's house, but a woman with her own light to cast. Chapter 6. Recovery and Betrayal. The treatment worked. Over the next 3 months, Travis regained his strength, the color returning to his face. The experimental procedure for his hypertrophic cardiomyopathy at Brigham and Women's Hospital had been scheduled within days of Nairobi presenting the check to the financial office. The medical team had been cautiously optimistic, but even they seemed surprised by how well Travis responded to the combination of surgical intervention and new drug therapy targeting his heart's electrical system. Nairobi cared for him diligently throughout his recovery, cooking the special diet the doctors recommended, administering medications, helping him through physical therapy. Her days fell into a new routine, preschool teaching in the mornings, home by early afternoon to assist Travis, household duties in the evenings. She had given up her night cleaning job, no longer desperate for every dollar now that the medical bills were covered. Travis's attitude during his recovery fluctuated between grudging appreciation and resentful dependence. He hated needing her help to shower, to dress, to manage the stairs. Each small gain in independence was celebrated not with gratitude, but with a visible relief at requiring less of her assistance. He never asked exactly what had transpired between her and Josh Inglis. Nairobi never volunteered the truth, allowing him to believe what he wanted. She told herself it didn't matter as long as he was recovering. The check had cleared, the treatment was working, and soon life would return to its previous patterns. Not happy, perhaps, but familiar. Then came the papers. It was a Tuesday morning. Nairobi had prepared Travis's breakfast: poached eggs on whole-grain toast, sliced avocado, the decaffeinated coffee he complained about, but the doctors insisted upon. He seemed more energetic than usual, almost animated as he entered the kitchen, a manila folder tucked under his arm. "What is this?" Nairobi asked, looking at the document Travis had pushed across the breakfast table after finishing his meal. "Divorce papers," Travis said, not meeting her eyes. "I'm filing on grounds of adultery." The mug of tea slipped from Nairobi's hands, shattering on the floor. "Adultery? I have never—" "You and Inglis," Travis cut her off. "Don't insult me by denying it. Why else would he give you the money?" "He gave it because—" Nairobi began, stunned by the accusation. "I've already told everyone," Travis continued, speaking over her protest. "My family, our neighbors, the company, everyone knows what you did." The cruelty of it stole Nairobi's breath. After everything, the years of verbal abuse, the sacrifice of her dignity, the months of caring for him, this was her reward. Not just abandonment, but public humiliation based on a lie. "I never slept with him," Nairobi said, her voice barely audible. "He gave the money because he saw how you treated me at that company party. He called it justice, not charity." Travis's expression hardened. "A convenient story. No one will believe it." He stood, gathering the folder. "I've spoken with my attorney. You'll be served officially this afternoon. I'm being generous with the settlement, $50,000. Enough for you to start over somewhere else. Consider yourself lucky I don't demand repayment for the treatment that saved my life." "And if I fight this?" Nairobi asked, surprising herself with the question. She had never challenged Travis directly before. His smile was cold. "On what grounds?" "Your word against mine. A foreign woman with no real status, no family connections, no resources for a legal battle." He shook his head. "Be practical, Nairobi. I have recorded phone conversations of you agreeing to meet Inglis at his hotel. That's all the evidence I need to paint you as unfaithful. Take the money and disappear." "Get out," Travis said, his voice cold. "You have until tomorrow. The house is in my name." Nairobi remained at the table long after Travis left, the broken mug forgotten at her feet. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window seemed to mock the darkness that had enveloped her world. Everything she had endured had been for security, for her parents, for herself. Now even that was being ripped away, replaced with a lie that would follow her wherever she went. That night, Nairobi packed her few belongings, placing them in the same suitcase she had brought to this house on her wedding day. How little had changed, yet how everything was different. She was still leaving with almost nothing. But this time, she had something Travis couldn't take, the truth of her own integrity. As she folded her clothes, a business card fell from the pocket of a jacket she rarely wore. Josh Inglis's private number, which he had pressed into her hand as she left his office. She had never expected to use it, yet now found herself reaching for her phone, dialing before she could reconsider. He answered on the second ring, his voice instantly recognizable. "Josh Inglis." "This is Nairobi Head," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I apologize for calling so late." "Mrs. Head," he replied, no surprise in his tone, as if he had been expecting her call for months. "How can I help you?" The simple question, genuine without agenda, broke something open inside her. Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. Travis's recovery, the divorce papers, the accusations, her imminent homelessness. When she finally fell silent, embarrassed by her outburst, Inglis spoke with calm certainty. "I have a guest house. It's yours for as long as you need it. No strings, no expectations." He paused briefly. "This isn't charity, Nairobi. It's what decent humans do for one another." "Why would you help me again?" she asked, echoing her question from their first meeting. His answer was simple. "Because your story isn't finished yet." That night, Nairobi called the only person she could think of who might help her move her belongings. A fellow teaching assistant from the preschool who had once offered friendship that Nairobi, isolated in her marriage, had been afraid to accept. To her surprise, Lisa arrived within the hour, her small car ready to transport Nairobi's meager possessions. "I never liked him," Lisa confided as they loaded the last box. "You deserve better." The words, spoken casually by someone who barely knew her, landed with unexpected weight. Deserve better. Had anyone ever suggested that what happened to Nairobi mattered, that she was entitled to something more than mere survival? As they drove away from the house that had been her prison for nearly 3 years, Nairobi felt something unexpected beneath her grief and shock, a flutter of possibility, terrifying yet exhilarating. For the first time in years, her future was entirely unwritten. Chapter 7. Shelter in the Storm. Josh Inglis lived in a modernist mansion overlooking the ocean, all glass and clean lines against the rugged Massachusetts coastline. The main house rose from the cliffs like a deliberate counterpoint to nature, angular where the rocks were jagged, transparent where the sea was opaque. The guest house, though smaller, shared the same architectural vision. A perfect cube of glass and steel nestled in a grove of wind-shaped pines. Nairobi had expected the security team to direct her to service quarters or perhaps a caretaker's apartment. Instead, she found herself escorted to a fully furnished guest house that was larger than Travis's entire home. The staff treated her with a deference she found unsettling, addressing her as Ms. Nathan rather than Mrs. Head, a detail she hadn't shared with anyone. "Mr. Inglis thought you might prefer your maiden name," explained the housekeeper, a practical woman in her 50s named Mrs. Chen, when Nairobi questioned this. "He said it was your choice, of course." It was the first of many small kindnesses that suggested Josh Inglis had thought carefully about her situation. The guest house refrigerator was stocked with fresh food. The closet contained a selection of basic clothing in her size, tags still attached, with a note explaining they were there if needed but could be returned if unwanted. The bookshelves held novels, yes, but also practical guides to divorce law in Massachusetts, immigrant rights, and financial planning for women in transition. Josh Inglis himself was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Chen explained that he was traveling on business but had left instructions for Nairobi to consider the property her home for as long as she needed. There were no expectations, no timeline, no pressure, just space to breathe, to think, to plan. He seemed unsurprised when his security called to announce Nairobi's arrival, ushering her into the spacious guest suite without pressing for details she wasn't ready to share. "Stay as long as you need," he said simply. "You're safe here." Only when the door closed behind him did Nairobi allow herself to collapse onto the bed and release the tears she'd been holding back. She cried for hours, for the young girl with dreams she once was, for the wasted years with Travis, for the shame that clung to her despite her innocence. The sobs came from somewhere deep and primal, a release of emotions she had suppressed for years. Grief for the life she had lost, fear of the uncertain future, relief at escaping a situation that had been slowly suffocating her. All poured out in a torrent that left her physically exhausted. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, the sun had set. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see lights illuminating the path to the main house and the dark expanse of the Atlantic beyond. The isolation should have been frightening, but instead felt like a respite. No judgmental neighbors, no demanding husband, no constant performance of the dutiful wife. In the morning, Mrs. Chen brought breakfast and fresh clothes. Josh was nowhere to be seen, but a note on elegant stationery sat beside her plate. "Take the time you need. When you're ready to talk, I'm here. You owe me nothing." It was the first truly kind gesture Nairobi had experienced in years. That simple note, the acknowledgement of her need for space, the absence of expectation, broke something open inside her that she thought had been sealed forever. For the first time since arriving in America, Nairobi found herself with nothing to do, nowhere to be, no one to please. The freedom was terrifying. She had defined herself for so long by her responsibilities, daughter, wife, caretaker, that her own desires had become foreign to her. What did she want? What gave her joy? Who was she when not reflecting someone else's expectations? The first week passed in a haze of sleep and tears. Her body, finally released from constant tension, seemed to collapse into a healing exhaustion. She slept for 10 to 12 hours at a time, waking only to eat the meals Mrs. Chen quietly left for her. Halfway through the second week, Nairobi woke with an unfamiliar energy. She showered, dressed in clothes that actually fit her slender frame, and walked the perimeter of the property. The March air was crisp, but not bitter, carrying the promise of spring. As she traced the path along the cliffside, watching waves crash against rocks below, something inside her began to stir. Not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. Possibility. That afternoon, she called her parents. The conversation was difficult. They had heard Travis's version of events, that Nairobi had been unfaithful, that her behavior had forced the divorce. Her father, always quick to believe the worst, had accepted this narrative without question. Her mother, more intuitive, sensed the lie, but had no power to contradict her husband's judgment. "Where are you staying?" her father demanded, his tone suggesting he expected her to be homeless or worse. "With a friend," Nairobi replied, unwilling to share more with someone who had chosen to believe the worst of her. "You should come home," he said, though home meant their cramped apartment, his disapproval, the weight of community judgment. "We can find you another husband, a man from our community this time." "No, Baba," Nairobi said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I will make my own way now." The call ended badly, with her father's anger and her own tears. Yet despite the pain, Nairobi felt a strange lightness afterward. She had spoken her truth, had refused to accept blame for something she hadn't done. It was a small act of rebellion, but significant. The first time she had directly contradicted her father's wishes. By the third week, Nairobi had established a routine. Mornings were spent walking the grounds, afternoons reading through the legal materials Josh had provided, evenings writing in a journal she had purchased online, delivered with other necessities by Mrs. Chen. She began to understand her legal position, her rights in the divorce, the strategies Travis might employ. She had never met the staff attorney Josh mentioned in one of his notes, but emails from a prestigious Boston law firm began arriving, outlining potential approaches to her case. The lawyer, a formidable-sounding woman named Eleanor Patel, requested a meeting at Ms. Nathan's convenience. There was never pressure, never a sense of obligation, just steady, practical support. A month into her stay, Nairobi ventured into the small coastal town nearby. She walked its streets anonymously, enjoying the simple pleasure of choosing what to look at, where to stop, what to eat. In a small bookstore, she purchased books on teaching credentials and certification requirements for Massachusetts. The simple act of planning for a future, however uncertain, felt revolutionary. It was on her return from town that she finally encountered Josh Inglis in person. He was sitting on the terrace of the main house, laptop open before him, casual in jeans and a sweater that looked deceptively simple but probably cost more than Travis's best suit. He glanced up as she approached, a smile warming his features. "Nairobi," he greeted her, closing his computer. "It's good to see you venturing out. How was town?" The normality of the exchange, as if they were old friends, as if she belonged in this world of wealth and ease, was disarming. Nairobi found herself responding naturally, telling him about the bookstore, the certification guides, her tentative plans. "Teaching was always your goal?" he asked, gesturing for her to join him at the table. "Before everything happened, yes," she admitted, taking the offered seat. I completed most of my education courses at community college, but Travis didn't see the point of my finishing the degree." Josh's expression darkened briefly. Men like Travis rarely see the point of women's ambitions. He paused, then added more lightly, "Unless those ambitions align with their own interests, of course." "Why are you helping me?" Nairobi asked abruptly, the question that had been circling her mind for weeks finally finding voice. "First the money for Travis's treatment, now this." She gestured at the guest house, the property, the implicit support. Josh considered her question seriously, his gaze turning toward the ocean. "I believe in correcting imbalances where I can," he said finally. "The world is fundamentally unjust in its distribution of power, resources, opportunities. When I see a specific injustice I can address, I do." "So I'm a charity case," Nairobi said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "A good deed to balance your karma." Josh's laugh was unexpected, genuine. "Hardly. You're a capable woman who's been systematically undermined by circumstances and the people who should have protected you. My resources are removing external barriers, but your resilience, your intelligence, those are entirely your own." He looked at her directly. "I'm not saving you, Nairobi. I'm just clearing the path so you can save yourself." The distinction was subtle but profound. Not a helpless victim to be rescued, but a capable person temporarily hindered by circumstances beyond her control. It was a perspective that honored her dignity rather than diminishing it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Josh stood. "Will you join me for dinner? Mrs. Chen makes an excellent Chiopino, and I've been craving it since London." The invitation was casual, without pressure or expectation. For the first time in years, Nairobi made a choice based solely on her own desire, rather than obligation or fear. "I'd like that," she said simply. That evening, as they shared the fragrant seafood stew and crusty bread, conversation flowed with surprising ease. Josh spoke of his projects, his travels, his ideas for addressing systemic inequality through technology. Nairobi found herself sharing stories of Kenya, of her grandmother's wisdom, of her own truncated dreams. "You know, those dreams don't have an expiration date," Josh observed as they finished the meal. "You're what, 25? Your life is just beginning." The simple observation, delivered without drama or sentimentality, settled into Nairobi's consciousness like a seed finding fertile soil. Perhaps this chapter of darkness, her marriage to Travis, the years of diminishment, wasn't the whole story. Perhaps it was merely the difficult beginning of a narrative still unfolding. That night, returning to the guest house under a canopy of stars, Nairobi felt something she had almost forgotten. A quiet anticipation for the morning, for the future, for the unwritten pages of her own story. Chapter 8. The Case. A week later, Josh found Nairobi sitting on the terrace overlooking the ocean. The early April air carried a hint of warmth, promising a spring that seemed metaphorical as well as literal. The time in his guest house had already begun to transform her. Regular meals, restful sleep, and the absence of constant criticism had softened the tight lines around her eyes. "Good morning," he greeted, setting a tray with coffee and pastries on the table between them. "Sleep well?" Nairobi nodded, accepting the offered cup with a small smile. These morning conversations had become a comfortable routine, undemanding, often about books they'd both read, or world events, never pressuring her to discuss her situation unless she raised it first. Today, however, she had news to share. "Travis is telling everyone I traded myself for his medical treatment," she said without preamble. "My family believes him. My father won't take my calls." Josh's expression darkened, his hands tightening briefly around his mug. "I suspected he might try something like this. Character assassination is a common tactic when the facts aren't in one's favor. "How can I fight it?" Nairobi asked, her voice smaller than she intended. "It's his word against mine, and he's a respected businessman while I'm just a woman of integrity who deserves justice," Josh finished firmly. "I have recordings." Nairobi looked up in surprise. "I record all my business meetings. It's standard practice in my position," Josh explained, setting down his coffee. "I have your entire conversation with me that day, your proposition, which I refused, and the true nature of the financial arrangement." Hope sparked in Nairobi's chest for the first time. "Can we use that?" "We can do more than that," Josh said, pulling out his phone. "I've taken the liberty of consulting the best divorce attorney in the city, Eleanor Patel, the lawyer who's been sending you those emails. We're countersuing Travis for defamation, emotional abuse, and financial misconduct." "Financial misconduct?" Nairobi's brow furrowed in confusion. Josh's expression was grim. "The money I gave for his treatment? He's invested half of it in a high-risk tech venture called Quantum Horizons. He never intended to pay his medical bills in full." Nairobi felt a strange laugh bubble up from her chest, not from humor, but from the absurd depth of Travis's betrayal. "How did you discover this?" "I have investments in many ventures. When I saw his name on the investor list for Quantum, I had my team investigate." Josh's tone was matter-of-fact, but his eyes reflected anger. "He diverted funds meant for life-saving treatment to a speculative investment. That's fraud." Nairobi absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the man she had lived with for nearly 3 years. Had she ever really known Travis at all? "Will you fight?" Josh asked, his eyes serious. Nairobi looked out at the vast ocean, its endless horizon a reminder of possibilities, yet unexplored. When she turned back to Josh, her decision was made. "Yes," she said firmly, "I will." The next weeks passed in a whirlwind of legal activity. Eleanor Patel, a formidable attorney in her 50s with a reputation for taking on powerful men, met with Nairobi multiple times to prepare their case. The countersuit they filed made headlines in local papers. The immigrant wife fighting back against accusations of infidelity with evidence of emotional abuse and financial misconduct. Travis's attorney attempted to have the case dismissed, arguing that Nairobi was simply a bitter wife seeking revenge. The motion was denied when Eleanor presented the recording of Nairobi's meeting with Josh, clearly proving that no intimate encounter had occurred and that Travis had lied about the nature of the financial arrangement. As the case progressed, more evidence emerged. Former household staff came forward, describing witnessing Travis's verbal abuse. Financial records showed not only the diversion of treatment funds, but also a pattern of financial control that had left Nairobi without resources of her own, despite her contributions to the household. Most damning was the testimony from Travis's doctor. Mr. Head's condition, while serious, was significantly exaggerated to his wife. The physician admitted reluctantly under oath. The experimental treatment we discussed was one option, but there were conventional treatments covered by insurance that offered similar outcomes. Mr. Head specifically requested information about the most expensive treatment options. A gasp ran through the courtroom. Travis had manipulated even his illness to control and test Nairobi. Throughout the proceedings, Nairobi maintained a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Travis's increasingly erratic courtroom behavior. As his carefully constructed narrative crumbled under cross-examination, he became visibly agitated, once having to be warned by the judge for an outburst. By the time Travis took the stand, his reputation was in tatters. His testimony, once practiced and confident, now seemed defensive and inconsistent. Under Eleanor's skilled questioning, he contradicted himself multiple times about the nature of his arrangement with Nairobi, his knowledge of the experimental treatment's necessity, and his use of the funds Josh had provided. So, to be clear, Mr. Head, Eleanor summarized near the end of her cross-examination, you asked your wife to prostitute herself to save your life, then divorced her when she received financial help without compromising her dignity, then defamed her character throughout your community, and then misappropriated funds intended for your medical care. Is that an accurate summary of events? Objection, Travis's attorney called desperately. Withdrawn, Eleanor said smoothly, but the damage was done. The courtroom had heard the truth laid bare in all its ugliness. The judge's ruling, when it came 2 weeks later, was unequivocal. The divorce was granted, but on grounds of Travis's cruelty, not Nairobi's non-existent infidelity. Travis was ordered to pay substantial alimony and damages for defamation, nearly $250,000, far more than his insulting initial offer. The investment he had made with the treatment money was to be liquidated and the full amount returned to Josh Inglis. Additionally, the court mandated that Travis would need to make a public retraction of his accusations to correct the damage to Nairobi's reputation. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed around them. Nairobi, who had always tried to make herself invisible, stood tall beside Josh as cameras flashed. "Ms. Nathan," one reporter called, "how does it feel to be vindicated?" Nairobi paused, considering. "Like breathing for the first time," she answered truthfully. In the car afterward, as Josh's driver navigated them away from the media circus, Nairobi sat in silence, processing the reality of her victory. It wasn't just the financial settlement, substantial as it was. It was the public acknowledgement of her truth, the restoration of her reputation, the clear marker between her past life and whatever came next. "What will you do now?" Josh asked quietly, respecting the weight of the moment. Nairobi turned to him, a tentative smile forming. "Finish my teaching degree. Build a life that's mine." She paused, then added with newfound confidence, "Begin again." Josh's answering smile held something beyond approval or pride, a warmth that suggested their paths would continue to intersect beyond this chapter of crisis and recovery. "Beginning again," he agreed, "sounds like exactly the right next step." Chapter 9. Healing Waters. In the months following the trial, Nairobi began to rebuild her life. The settlement from Travis provided a financial foundation, but it was the freedom from his control that truly transformed her. She moved from Josh's guest house to a small apartment of her own in Cambridge, close enough to finish her education at a local university, yet far enough from her previous life to feel like a fresh start. Josh offered her a position managing community outreach for his foundation, work that utilized her natural empathy and gave her financial independence for the first time. The role was flexible enough to accommodate her classes and provided a purpose beyond her own healing. "We're launching initiatives for immigrant women in crisis situations," Josh explained during her informal interview. "Your experience gives you insights that would be invaluable, but only if you're ready," he added. "There's no obligation." Nairobi considered the offer carefully. Working with women who shared similar struggles would mean confronting her own trauma repeatedly, yet it also offered the chance to transform her pain into something meaningful, to create pathways for others that hadn't existed for her. "I'd like to try," she said finally, "even if it's difficult." The work proved challenging but deeply rewarding. Nairobi discovered talents she hadn't known she possessed: public speaking, grant writing, program development. The Foundation's resources, combined with her first-hand understanding of vulnerability, created programs that actually addressed the practical needs of women in crisis. Her apartment slowly transformed from an empty space to a home that reflected her emerging identity. She found an affordable but bright one-bedroom with large windows that let in streams of natural light. Unlike Travis's beige-on-beige aesthetic, Nairobi filled her space with colors and textures that pleased her. Jewel-toned pillows, hand-woven baskets reminiscent of her childhood in Kenya, walls painted a soft terracotta that reminded her of her grandmother's house. She reconnected with her family, though the relationship remained complicated. Her father had seen the court case coverage and, faced with undeniable evidence of Travis's misconduct, had reluctantly acknowledged that Nairobi had been wronged. Still, there remained an unspoken reproach in his manner, as if her failure to make the marriage work somehow reflected poorly on her upbringing. Her mother, however, embraced Nairobi's new independence with quiet pride. Despite her ongoing cancer treatments, she found strength in her daughter's resilience. "You are becoming the woman I always knew you could be," she told Nairobi during one of their longer phone calls, her voice weak but determined. "My only regret is that I allowed your father to pressure you into that marriage." "You found your strength," she said during one of their phone calls, "like the women in our family have always done, even when it seemed impossible." The greatest healing came through Nairobi's education. Returning to her teaching courses brought her in contact with others who shared her passion for early childhood development. She formed friendships, tentative at first, then increasingly confident, with classmates who knew nothing of her past and accepted her simply as the thoughtful, intelligent woman she was. "You have such a natural way with children," her practicum supervisor commented after observing Nairobi lead a reading circle. "Your students respond to your warmth and authenticity. That can't be taught." These simple affirmations of her inherent worth, separate from her role as wife or daughter, helped Nairobi reclaim parts of herself that had been systematically dismantled during her marriage. When she developed an innovative curriculum unit incorporating multicultural storytelling techniques from her Kenyan heritage, her professors encouraged her to present it at a regional education conference. Standing at the podium, fielding questions from experienced educators who treated her as a peer, Nairobi felt another piece of her confidence lock back into place. By fall semester, she had begun her student teaching at a diverse elementary school, working with kindergartners whose unguarded enthusiasm and curiosity reminded her daily of the person she had been before Travis: open, hopeful, genuinely engaged with the world. Josh remained a constant presence, respectful of her boundaries but always supportive. They developed a friendship built on mutual respect, sharing quiet dinners and long conversations about books, ideas, and dreams. He never pushed for more, seeming content with whatever shape their relationship took. On the anniversary of her divorce, Josh invited her to dinner at his home. The terrace was lit with hundreds of tiny lights, the table set with elegant simplicity, the ocean providing a soundtrack of gentle waves. "To freedom," Josh toasted, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," Nairobi added, touching her glass to his. As they ate, Nairobi found herself studying Josh's face, the kindness in his eyes, the way he listened intently when she spoke. She realized with a start that somewhere along the way, her feelings had deepened into something more than friendship. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. After Travis, she had promised herself never to be dependent on a man again, never to surrender her hard-won autonomy. Yet Josh had never asked for her dependence, had in fact been instrumental in helping her achieve independence. "What are you thinking?" Josh asked, catching her gaze. "That I'm not afraid anymore," Nairobi answered honestly. Josh reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Good," he said softly, "because I've been waiting for you to be ready to hear something important." The moment hung between them, full of possibility. For the first time since she could remember, Nairobi didn't feel the need to brace for disappointment or hurt. Instead, she felt a quiet certainty that whatever came next would be honest, respectful, and genuinely considerate of her feelings. "I'm listening," she said, turning her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. The smile that spread across Josh's face contained no triumph, no smugness, just a genuine happiness that mirrored the warmth blooming in her own chest. Whatever this was between them, it wasn't the desperate transaction her marriage had been, but something far more precious, a connection between equals, freely chosen. As the evening breeze carried the scent of salt and distant flowers across the terrace, Nairobi felt the final pieces of her old self falling away. The woman who emerged from the shadows of her past was stronger, wiser, and finally ready to accept that she deserved not just freedom from cruelty, but the active presence of kindness in her life. The ocean stretched endless and dark beyond the terrace, its vastness no longer intimidating but comforting, a reminder that some forces are powerful enough to reshape even the most unyielding landscapes, given enough time and persistent motion. Like those healing waters, Nairobi had found the strength to reshape her own life, to carve new channels where hope could finally flow unimpeded. Chapter 10. Declarations. "I've fallen in love with you," Josh said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not out of pity or a desire to rescue you. I've fallen in love with your courage, your resilience, your kindness that survived despite everything trying to crush it." The words hung in the night air between them, honest and unadorned. No manipulation, no expectations, just truth offered with the understanding that she was free to accept or decline. Nairobi felt tears spring to her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of pain. They were an overflow of emotions too complex to name. Gratitude for this man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, fear of trusting again despite everything, and a cautious joy at the realization that her heart hadn't been permanently closed by Travis's cruelty. "You don't need to respond now," Josh continued, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I know you're still healing. I know trust doesn't come easily anymore. I'm willing to wait or to accept if friendship is all you can offer." Nairobi looked at their joined hands, then up at the man who had helped her reclaim her life without demanding anything in return. In his eyes, she saw something she had never witnessed in Travis's: genuine respect, a recognition of her as a complete person rather than an accessory to his life. "I thought love was a myth," she said softly. "Something people talked about in books but didn't exist in real life. With Travis, I accepted its absence because I never knew its presence." She took a deep breath. "But what I feel for you, it's like discovering a color I never knew existed." Josh's smile was radiant. "Is that a yes?" "It's a I'm scared but willing to try," Nairobi answered honestly. "It's a be patient with me." "I can work with that," Josh said, bringing her hand to his lips. Their courtship unfolded slowly, each step forward a conscious choice rather than an obligation. Josh respected her need for independence, never pressuring her to move in with him despite the practicality it would offer. Nairobi maintained her apartment, her job at the foundation, her studies, building a life that was genuinely hers, one that would exist with or without a relationship. Yet increasingly, their lives intertwined. Weekend trips to art exhibitions in New York, quiet evenings cooking together in Josh's kitchen, long walks along the beach during which they shared childhood stories and future dreams. Josh met her parents during their visit to Boston, charming her mother and eventually earning a grudging respect from her father with his sincere interest in their culture and history. Nairobi grew close to Josh's sister, Caroline, a pediatric surgeon whose directness and compassion reminded her of her grandmother. Caroline became both friend and informal mentor, the first person besides Josh with whom Nairobi felt comfortable discussing her past. "My brother told me some of what happened to you," Caroline said during one of their coffee meetings. "Not details, he would never violate your privacy, but enough to understand that you've been through hell." Her gaze was steady, uncompromising. "I need you to know that if he ever treats you with anything less than absolute respect, You can come to me even if it's Josh, especially if it's Josh. The declaration, delivered with such fierce protectiveness, brought fresh tears to Nairobi's eyes. This was what family should be. People who put your well-being above loyalty to their own blood. That night, as Josh walked her to her car, he kissed her for the first time, gently, asking permission with each incremental closeness. It was nothing like the mechanical pecks Travis had bestowed during their wedding ceremony. This kiss held promise, tenderness, and profound respect. For the first time, Nairobi understood what it meant to be truly desired, not as a possession or a symbol, but as herself. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall. Nairobi completed her education degree with honors and accepted a full-time teaching position at a progressive elementary school where her multicultural background was viewed as an asset rather than something to be overcome. Her students adored her, their parents respected her, and her colleagues valued her input on curriculum development. Josh's business expanded globally, requiring more frequent travel. He always invited Nairobi to join him when her schedule permitted, but never made her feel guilty when she chose to remain focused on her developing career. They learned the rhythm of separation and reunion, the art of maintaining connection across time zones, the joy of coming together after absence. Though their relationship seemed idyllic from the outside, they faced challenges like any couple. Josh's workaholic tendencies sometimes created tension, and his wealth occasionally made Nairobi uncomfortable in social situations where she felt scrutinized. They had their disagreements about time management, about how publicly to share their relationship, about whether Josh should intervene in a legal dispute involving her father's business. But unlike her marriage to Travis, these conflicts were addressed with mutual respect, each disagreement becoming an opportunity to understand each other more deeply, rather than a battle for control. During one of Josh's trips to Japan, Nairobi received an unexpected visitor at her classroom after school hours. Travis Head stood in her doorway, noticeably thinner than when she had last seen him in court, his once immaculate appearance now slightly disheveled. "What are you doing here?" Nairobi asked, instinctively moving behind her desk, putting distance between them. "I needed to see you," Travis said, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "To apologize," Nairobi regarded him warily. "Apologize for what, exactly? The emotional abuse, the lies, the public humiliation?" "All of it," Travis admitted, looking genuinely contrite. "The investment I made with Inglis's money, it collapsed. I lost everything, the house, my job, my reputation." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out karma is real after all." "What do you want from me?" Nairobi asked, her tone measured. "Nothing," Travis replied, surprising her. I've been in therapy. Part of recovery is making amends where possible." He met her eyes directly. "I was cruel to you because I was terrified of my own inadequacies. You deserved better." The admission, so at odds with the Travis she had known, left Nairobi momentarily speechless. She had imagined this confrontation many times, but always with her delivering cutting remarks to a defensive Travis. His genuine remorse disarmed her prepared responses. "Thank you for saying that," she finally managed. "I hope your therapy continues to help you." Travis nodded, turning to leave before pausing at the door. "You look happy," he observed. "It suits you." After he left, Nairobi sat at her desk for a long time, processing the encounter. She felt no triumph at Travis's downfall, no vindictive pleasure in his suffering. Instead, she felt a final release, the last cords binding her to that painful chapter of her life, severed by his unexpected apology. That evening, she called Josh in Tokyo, describing the encounter in detail. "How do you feel about it?" he asked, his voice clear despite the thousands of miles between them. "Free," Nairobi answered truthfully, "like I can finally put it all behind me." "I'm coming home early," Josh decided. "There's something I need to ask you in person." 3 days later, they walked along the beach at sunset. The November air crisp, but not yet winter cold. Josh seemed uncharacteristically nervous, his usual easy confidence replaced by a restless energy that had Nairobi both curious and concerned. "Is everything all right?" she asked as they reached a secluded cove where they often stopped to watch the waves. "Everything is perfect," Josh replied, taking both her hands in his. "Which is why I can't wait any longer to ask you something important." As he knelt on the sand before her, Nairobi felt her heart racing. Part of her had expected this moment eventually, but the reality of it, this brilliant, kind man looking up at her with Sue, such love still seemed dreamlike in its perfection. "Nairobi Nathan," Josh began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You are the strongest, most compassionate person I've ever known. Loving you has made me better in every way. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The ring he held was nothing like the practical band Travis had placed on her finger years ago. This was a sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds, unusual and distinctive, as unique as their journey together. "Are you sure?" Nairobi heard herself asking, old insecurities briefly resurfacing. "Your world is so different from mine, your family, your colleagues." "Love you," Josh finished firmly. "Everyone who matters in my life loves you, but even if they didn't, it wouldn't change how I feel." He smiled up at her. "I'm not asking you to become part of my world, Nairobi. I'm asking if we can create a new world together." The distinction meant everything, not absorption but partnership, not surrender but co-creation. "Yes," Nairobi said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you." As Josh slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to embrace her, Nairobi felt the final pieces of her healing lock into place. This wasn't a marriage of convenience or necessity. It was a choice made from strength rather than weakness, from love rather than obligation. Later that night, nestled against Josh in the warmth of his bed, Nairobi found herself thinking of her grandmother's stories about rivers finding their way to the sea, how they might be diverted, dammed, even forced underground, but would eventually, inevitably, reach their destination. "What are you thinking about?" Josh murmured against her hair, sensing her wakefulness. "That sometimes the longest journeys lead exactly where we need to go," Nairobi replied, "even when we can't see the destination from the starting point." Josh's arms tightened around her, a sanctuary freely offered rather than a cage to contain. "And where do you think we're going?" he asked, curious about her philosophical mood. Nairobi turned in his embrace, meeting his gaze in the dimness. "Somewhere neither of us has been before," she said softly. "Somewhere we'll discover together." Chapter 11. Full Circle. The wedding was everything Nairobi's first ceremony had not been: joyful, genuine, and entirely of her choosing. They married in early summer on the cliffside property that had been her first sanctuary, the ocean serving as backdrop to their vows. Unlike her wedding to Travis, where her father had surrendered her like property being transferred, this time Nairobi walked herself down the aisle. Her white dress, adorned with subtle embroidery inspired by Kenyan textiles, symbolized her blended identity, honoring her roots while embracing her future. Only 50 guests attended, people who had genuinely contributed to their happiness. Nairobi's parents sat in the front row, her mother beaming with pride, her father finally showing genuine approval. Josh's sister Caroline served as her maid of honor, while his business partner Marcus stood as best man. Most meaningful were the 6 young women seated prominently near the front, the first graduates of the Foundation's program for immigrant women in crisis, all of whom had found stability and purpose with Nairobi's guidance. Their presence represented everything she had built from the ashes of her past. Josh's vows, spoken with unwavering certainty, acknowledged their unusual journey. "I didn't rescue you," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "You rescued yourself. I just had the privilege of witnessing your transformation. Today, I don't promise to protect you from life's storms. I promise to stand beside you through them, knowing your strength matches my own." Nairobi's response, delivered in a clear voice that carried across the gathering, completed the circle. "I once thought love was just another word for control. You taught me it's actually freedom, the freedom to be fully myself and still be cherished. Today, I choose you, not from necessity, but from joy, not from obligation, but from love." Their honeymoon took them to Kenya, where Josh experienced the world that had shaped Nairobi's earliest years. They visited her grandmother's village, now equipped with a medical clinic funded by their foundation. Children played in the schoolyard of a newly renovated building bearing a simple plaque: "Education is the doorway to choice." In Nairobi's namesake city, they met with women's groups developing microfinance initiatives for single mothers and widows. Josh listened more than he spoke, understanding this was Nairobi's territory to navigate, her expertise to share. "Your money is helping," one elder woman told him appreciatively. "But her understanding is worth more. She knows what it means to rebuild from nothing." Upon their return to Boston, they settled into a rhythm of purposeful work and genuine partnership. Their home, a renovated historic property halfway between the city and the coast, became a gathering place for friends, colleagues, and the extended family they had created through their foundation work. 5 years into their marriage, Nairobi sat in her office at the Inglis Foundation in downtown San Francisco, where they had relocated to expand their work nationally. The woman, reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows, barely resembled the frightened, diminished person she had once been. Now executive director of educational initiatives, she oversaw programs in 15 cities, her teaching background informing curriculum that helped displaced women acquire skills for economic independence. "Mrs. Inglis," her assistant called from the doorway, "the board is ready for you." "Thank you, Emily," Nairobi replied, gathering her presentation materials. The boardroom fell silent as she entered. 12 faces turned toward her. Corporate executives, philanthropists, and women's rights advocates who made up the leadership of what was now one of the most influential foundations for domestic abuse survivors in America. "Thank you all for coming," Nairobi began, her voice confident and clear. "Today marks the 5th anniversary of our first women's shelter opening in Boston. Since then, we've expanded to 15 locations across the country, providing safe haven for over 3,000 women and their children." As she presented the annual report, Nairobi felt a familiar surge of purpose. Each number represented a life changed, a cycle broken. When her phone vibrated discreetly, she glanced down to see a message from Josh. "Reservations at 7. Love you beyond words." A warm smile touched her lips. 5 years of marriage hadn't diminished their connection. It had only deepened it. The meeting concluded with approval for 3 new shelter locations, including one in her parents' native Kenya. As the board members filed out, Nairobi's father, now the foundation's community liaison, squeezed her shoulder with pride. "Your mother would be so proud," he said softly, referring to her passing 6 months ago after her long battle with cancer finally ended. "I know I am." Their relationship had healed over the years, forgiveness gradually replacing the hurt of his past decisions. Now, in his 70s, he dedicated his retirement to helping immigrant families navigate American systems without falling prey to exploitation. Later that evening, Nairobi changed into a simple blue dress at their Pacific Heights home. Josh entered as she was fastening her necklace, a sapphire pendant he had given her on their first anniversary. "You look beautiful," he said, wrapping his arms around her waist and meeting her eyes in the mirror. 5 years, Nairobi mused, leaning back against him. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like another lifetime. Any regrets? Josh asked. Nairobi turned to face him. Not one. Not even the hard parts. They led me here. On their drive to dinner, they passed a familiar face on a street corner. Travis Head, considerably thinner, distributing flyers for a local business. His investment failure had led to a fraud conviction and a brief prison term. Upon release, he had struggled to rebuild his life, his reputation in tatters. Nairobi felt a brief flicker of recognition, but no pain. That chapter was closed. "Do you think about how differently things might have turned out?" Josh asked quietly as they continued toward the restaurant. Nairobi considered the question, watching the lights of the city come alive around them. "No," she said finally. "I'm too busy thinking about what comes next." Epilogue. Midnight's Daughter. The restaurant overlooked the bay, the Golden Gate Bridge illuminated against the night sky. Josh had reserved a private dining alcove where candlelight cast intimate shadows across their table. 5 years of marriage had only deepened their connection, transforming initial attraction into something richer, more complex, and infinitely more satisfying. As they finished their anniversary dinner, Josh reached across the table to take Nairobi's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet studded with 5 sapphires. "One for each year," he explained as he fastened it around her wrist. Nairobi admired how the stones caught the light, their deep blue reminiscent of the ocean that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their relationship. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "I have something for you too, but not here." Josh's eyes darkened with interest. "Home, then?" The drive back to their Pacific Heights residence was charged with anticipation. Nairobi felt a familiar heat building as Josh's hand rested on her thigh, his touch both respectful and possessive in a way that still thrilled her. Their physical relationship had evolved gradually as Nairobi healed from past trauma, Josh's patience allowing her to discover desire on her own terms. What had emerged was a passion neither had anticipated, powerful precisely because it was built on trust and mutual respect rather than obligation or control. At home, Nairobi led Josh to their bedroom terrace, where she had prepared an intimate setting earlier that day. Plush cushions created a comfortable seating area, string lights twinkled overhead, and a bottle of champagne chilled in an ice bucket. "Sit," she instructed, gently pushing him onto the cushions before disappearing inside. When she returned moments later, she wore only a sheer silk robe that revealed more than it concealed, her dark skin glowing in the soft lighting. Josh's breath caught visibly as she moved toward him with a confidence that would have been unimaginable years ago. "You once called me Midnight's Daughter," she said, referring to a poem he had written for her shortly after they began dating. "Tonight, I wanted to remind you why." She knelt before him, her movements deliberate and unhurried. This was Nairobi, fully in her power, not performing for his pleasure but sharing her own, her desire neither hidden nor apologetic. "You freed me to want," she whispered, her hands moving to the buttons of his shirt. "To need. To take." Josh remained still beneath her touch, allowing her to set the pace as she always did in their intimate moments. His restraint, born of respect rather than disinterest, only intensified the electricity between them. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said, voice rough with desire, as she slipped the silk from her shoulders. "Not a thing," Nairobi corrected gently, straddling his lap. "A woman, complete in herself, choosing to share herself with you." Their kiss deepened, years of intimacy allowing them to communicate without words, when to yield, when to advance, how to bring each other to the edge of control without surrendering it completely. Later, as they lay tangled in sheets beneath the stars, Nairobi's head resting on Josh's chest, she shared her anniversary gift, news of the expansion of their foundation's work to support children traumatized by domestic violence, a project funded entirely through her own successful investments. "You've built something extraordinary," Josh said, voice filled with genuine admiration. "Sometimes I wonder how I got lucky enough to witness it." Nairobi propped herself up on one elbow, her free hand tracing the contours of his face. "Not luck," she corrected. "Choice. Every day, we choose each other. That's what makes this real." As moonlight bathed their intertwined forms, Nairobi Nathan Inglis embodied the truth of her journey. From shadow to substance, from possession to partner, from survival to triumph. In Josh's arms, she was neither diminished nor elevated, but perfectly, completely herself. Midnight's daughter now fully stepped into her light.